don't clap until I'm finished, okay? I'm afraid, is the volume okay? Do a volume check, all right? All right, I'm going to talk about saving electricity in a hurry. This is not going to be a technical talk. At Lawrence Berkeley Lab, I lead a group called the Electronics, Lighting, and Networks group, where I do the technical stuff. But now this is the other half, so to speak. So let's just get started. I'm going to be talking about a special kind of crisis in the electricity area that occurs perhaps more frequently than you might guess. These are temporary shortfalls in electricity supplies, and it's generally when the electricity, there's more electricity required than is available. But what happens is something has gone wrong with the grid, and so there's the prospects, or it has already occurred, a blackout or a brownout or some sort of shortfall. And these shortfalls are unusual because they're expected to only last a few days, or maybe a few weeks, or maybe even a few months, like the summer or something. And so it's not like you'll find in many developing countries where every day there's 4 hours of blackouts or something. These are usually in developed countries with a completely adequate grid, which is not California anymore. But then they have some sort of shortfall, some sort of crisis, which I'll start describing in a minute. And those crises can be caused by either technical or environmental or even political reasons. But the important thing about these crises, and this is what makes them unique, is there's not enough time to bring in another replacement generator or make the repairs, whatever the technical problem is. And so for a short time, there's not enough power to go around. And so the grid is intact, but there's not enough electrons for what the consumers want. And so there's this dilemma for a policymaker in these situations. How do you avoid a blackout? And this is serious business because in California, well, let's start globally. Generally, these crises lead to the energy minister, the minister of energy in whatever country or region you're talking about, gets sacked. He gets fired. In California, we lost the governor that way. And that's why Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor, is because of an electricity crisis, exactly like I described. So this is serious business. If in 20 years, when you're in the Energy Commission or the Department of Energy or Ministry of Energy or Power in some country, this is what you get scared about. Because if this is what will lose your job. Okay, so what are we talking about? Well, the fact of the matter is I don't have enough time to get through all my slides. So I'm going to show you the conclusions right now, and then I can go through the rest of this a lot more leisurely. And if we go down a rabbit hole or we get stalled on something like the videos I'm going to show you, it's okay. You know what the answer is. What we discovered is that through various kinds of campaigns to change the behavior of energy consumers, for a short period, we could greatly reduce the electricity demand. Now that change in behavior could be a matter of days, weeks, or months. But you can see that from these examples that I'm going to describe a little bit, they were able to reduce electricity consumption as much as 25% for a short period of time. And that was enough to get the system through the crisis, then avoid further blackouts, and keep the economy going. So I'm going to talk about that. In fact, let me go one more conclusions. Let's see, does that work? Yes. Here are the conclusions, that you can actually get rapid temporary reductions in demand without damaging the economy. And that's what you as a future policymaker will be very concerned about. And another conclusion you'll see in here is that you need to use the media. This is, if you're going to change people's behavior, that's going to be your tool. And humor is important. And I'll say it right now, economists don't know what humor is. It never enters into their models. yet it can save you a gigawatt in these kinds of crises. Another aspect that economists get a little bit surprised about is that most of these crises were solved without a change in electricity prices. And I'll explain why in a little bit. And finally, as you think about what's been happening in California in the last few weeks, these kinds of crises are going to be happening more frequently. So those are now you can go to sleep, but let's talk about what are the crises. What kinds of crises cause these short-term electricity shortages? Well, a common example is a country or region is served by electricity generating from dams, hydroelectric, and there's a drought. So Brazil formerly was 90% hydro, and when it has a drought, they've got an electricity problem. But we have other causes. We have things like flawed deregulation in California or in Norway. And we had a tsunami and then a nuclear meltdown in Japan. We had earlier, 10 years earlier, we had a situation where the Tokyo Electric Power Company basically lied about all the safety inspections on their nuclear power plants. And so they were, when it was discovered, they were forced to shut down all of their nuclear power plants very quickly. And so that was almost a precursor to the problems they had in 2011. But we have other very common sorts of problems. A transformer blows up. That happened in Arizona. I'll show you some pictures of that. There was a refinery explosion in Australia and an avalanche in Alaska. I'll get back to that because that has a Davis connection. But there are heat waves and cold waves in all sorts of countries. Even economic growth, if it happens unexpectedly fast, can cause some of these short-term problems. And there were wildfires in Australia. There are always wildfires in Australia, and now there are always wildfires in California. My train, now twice coming from Berkeley, has been interrupted by those wildfires. So let's get on. So the important thing about these kinds of short-term electricity problems is understanding that the technical failures, whatever happened, can't be repaired instantly. And this is probably the best example. There was an explosion at a transformer station in Arizona, a key transformer station. When that transformer went, suddenly the utility in Arizona lost about 25 or 30% of its ability to deliver electricity in the middle of the summer at the peak demand for electricity. And so they had a real problem. They had to make sure that everybody reduced their demand very quickly. Well, how long does it take to replace a transformer? Turns out you don't build those transformers overnight. And it was only by good chance that they discovered one parked in the state of Washington. And they had to put it on a barge to bring it down to Los Angeles and then carry it on this little convoy from Los Angeles all the way to Arizona at something like 10 miles an hour. And so that was on the television show, on the television news every night. Where was the transformer? Because that was key to people. Well, we'll come back to that, all right? Oops, why is that not working? Just a moment, I have to make sure. Yes, let's try that one. Okay, so under those circumstances, what are the strategies to balance the grid? You probably can think about it. The first is you have blackouts, and that's often what happens regardless because the crisis is maybe unanticipated. But then what do? How do you quickly reduce demand of electricity? There are really only three options after the blackouts. You raise the price of electricity. That's what an economist will tell you to do. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I'll explain to you why that you probably shouldn't listen to an economist in these cases. You may ration electricity. That means you limit the electricity to each person. I'll come back to that. Or you reduce the demand quickly through some sorts of behavioral changes. So let's go through some of those. You could have a blackout. It always happens, maybe for maybe at the time of the crisis, but it really is the worst possible option, and all of us have just lived through that. And you may not have experienced it directly, but you can tell that Governor Newsom is desperately worried that we not have another widespread outage like we had in the past, because his future may be in peril. Let's see. This was in Japan when they had their outage. They actually had their shortage. They were saying, we're turning off all our escalators right now. Let's see. So let's go on. So why not just raise the price of electricity to reduce demand? It turns out it's not very easy to reduce the demand for to raise the price of electricity in a hurry, because there are a lot of regulatory hurdles. And even if you could quickly raise the price of electricity, will people actually see that price rise? It takes a month to get your utility bill, or maybe you never really do see your electricity bill. So as a result, there's no guarantee that raising the price or adjusting the price in some way is going to get that quick reduction in demand that you need. And you need that reduction in hours, days, or maybe weeks in order to get you through this crisis. So, again, just not only are there the technical obstacles of implementing a price change in electricity, but there are serious political obstacles about how you will spread this cost among all the customers. So, as I say down here, higher electricity prices will play a small role in most programs to quickly reduce electricity consumption. So what do? Maybe you ration electricity. And that has problems too, because each rationing plan affects groups differently. Do you reduce consumption by a flat amount? Do you say everybody gets a certain amount of kilowatt hours per month? Or do you say everybody needs to reduce their consumption by 15%? And each one of those kinds of strategies leads to different groups suffering possibly disproportionately. So once again, while it may be attractive, it's difficult to implement and it's politically fraught. Okay, so this is really what I wanted to get to, changing behavior. So it turns out that behavior can be changed surprisingly rapidly under certain circumstances. And if you can mobilize it, it may be the cheapest, most effective, and fastest way to reduce electricity in a hurry. But it's not straightforward, and there's, like many of these other strategies, it's not guaranteed. But you would be foolish not to try to do it. And so somehow you have to convince people that a crisis exists, and you have to explain to them how their actions will contribute to the public benefit, to both their personal and greater community benefit. And you also have to then say, after you've got people saving energy, you have to keep encouraging them and telling them why this is good. You're doing a wonderful job. Keep it up. We've only got a few more weeks of this before we can get back to our normal behavior. And sometimes there'll be incentives and a few other things going on. These happen to be some advertisements from a electricity short crisis in New Zealand. New Zealand always has electricity crises. It's kind of interesting because it's a very fragile grid and so on. But here, these are examples of little advertisements that the New Zealand media used. And curiously, these were developed after California had their crisis. And it's because the man who organized the California campaign to reduce electricity consumption in 2001 met the energy minister of New Zealand, and they had a little conversation. They realized this is important, and they started trading ideas. So this came from California and went to New Zealand. So you need, in a voluntary program, you really need mass participation. Everybody's got to do a small gesture, a small change in their behavior, but together that makes an enormous difference in the electricity consumption. And the key aspect that what you'll see is that you've got to make electricity saving popular and discussed, and something that you will want to you will talk to your friends and your relatives about. And if it's funny, it turns out you might do something a little different than you had never done before. And I guess I can give an example of Art Rosenfeld, who was one of the founders of this program. During a water shortage in California, where suddenly we had water rationing, he came to our house not with a glass of the bottle of wine for a dinner party. He brought a bucket of water so that he could flush the toilet. And so, but it was funny, and to have somebody do that kind of change of behavior, which you could never imagine happening in a normal circumstance, but that suddenly made that whole idea of saving and changing your behavior very acceptable. And now I'm telling you about it. So now it's certainly kind of funny, I think. So let me give you an example of first one program that I thought was a failure in Japan. This is an advertisement in Japan that was put out to save electricity during one of the earlier crises. And it's so information dense, and first of all, you can't read it, but that's not so important here. But you can look at how much information is in there, the content and the presentation. And this is a movie star, which is a good thing. But in terms of telling people so many little things, this is, you know what, any guesses what they're trying to tell you there? What are they trying to tell you?
Reduce the load.
Yep, they're telling you don't use energy during that yellow period. And that little thing in here, that's an air conditioner, just so you know. And then here are all these little different measures. Do you know what this one is?
Rice cooker.
No.
It's a water tea kettle.
It's their, what's in Japanese, it's called potto. It's a hot water device to make tea and so on. But it constantly is operating and heating up that water and reheating the water and reheating the water. And so it does draw power consistently. So lots of information there. And I would say not a very successful one. And now we'll look at some videos. I hope. Let's see if I can do this right. Excuse me. Help.
Escape out of it is on your desktop?
I'm trying to find escape here for some reason. End show. There we go. I'm sorry, I wasn't quite prepared for this. I just have to find it's a little deeper than I imagined. Okay, so let's go to Norway first. No, I don't want that one. Sorry. Yes, this one. Here. So Norway had an electricity crisis. It was caused by a drought. And Norway's electricity mainly comes from hydro, but they had deregulated the electricity markets in Scandinavia, and the Danes were especially clever in recognizing that they could buy the cheap hydro from Norway and sell it someplace else, so that when there was a drought, Norway discovered they didn't have enough electricity. So they had to conserve electricity quickly. And this was, I don't have volume, do I? It doesn't really matter, I guess. But.
You can stick your microphone. There we go.
The wording there in my Norwegian isn't very good. Is don't treat electricity as. Would you treat electricity like they're doing gasoline here? And let me show you one more of these from Norway, just so you can see the effect. So is that a good a commercial or advertisement to encourage conservation?
I think the gasoline one is better because people do that with water.
But this is to save electricity, by the way.
Yeah.
These are.
They generally use this, but I think the gas one hits home probably a lot more. It's way more expensive.
Any other opinions? Does it tell you what to do?
It's obvious.
Does it tell you want to save gasoline as a way to stop spilling gasoline as a way of reducing your electricity use? What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to save electricity?
Oh, and this one I was thinking, just turn off the faucet.
Turn off.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my thought was like, I was waiting for it to show sort of the corollary for electricity. Like, is it just turn off the lights when you're not using it, or is it like to just not leave your TV on all day? Like, people don't, I don't think that's a problem. So I think it's like, you know, people should like unplug things or turn large appliances off, but this doesn't give you any information about that.
I think it might have been a little bit more of an improvement if they would have like had the people getting their bill and then like freaking out and then turning the water off or like turning the gas pump off. Like that maybe driven the point home a little bit more clearly.
I'm not sure electricity prices actually went up during this period, but did it make people feel good? So the message is basically bad, bad, bad. All right, let's show some other ones. I hope. Let's see. Here's one from New Zealand. I hope you can understand their English.
It's an egg break. Go and turn something off.
She said it's an ad break. That's an advertisement break on television. She's a movie star or something, some sort of character there. She said it's an ad break, turn something off, and then what you can't see there is the end is...
It's an egg break. Go and turn something off.
There. This is their logo, which is Target. I can't remember how much it is. Target 10%. They needed everybody to reduce electricity. They needed electricity consumption to fall by 10% quickly, and so they created a whole series of advertisements like this. Very short, very simple, but always ending with Target 10%. Let me give you one more.
You don't need your heated towel off during the day.
So that was fast, but it's not so common in the United States, but we have, in Europe and in New Zealand, they have these racks that heat up your towels. And it's powered by electricity, and they heat it heats all day, even if you're not using the towel until the evening. So they were saying, just turn that off, and it's very short, but that's it. Now, what do you think of that? Those advertisements, are those effective?
I think like assuming that everyone pretty much knew what was going on at the time in terms of the energy shortages, those are effective. You're like, oh right, I forgot about this, and now I'm being reminded to do it in a funny and relatable way by someone I want to be my friend.
That's right. Okay, so let's show one more.
You don't need your heated charcoal on during the day. And being lived happily and lived happily ever after.
Use major appliances helps avoid rolling blackouts. Conservation, it's a way of life.
Let me show it once more. I like it, that's fine.
And being lived happily and lived happily ever after.
Waiting until after 7 p.m. to use major appliances helps avoid rolling blackouts. Conservation, it's a way of life.
All right, so let's talk about that one. What did you see that was different there?
They showed time. It's kind of like direct correlation. They showed like the time on the clock. She was waiting exactly until 7 o'clock, trying to use her appliance like after the major peak hour.
I can tell you that people who watched this during the electricity crisis remembered and saw this advertisement, remembered 7 o'clock long afterwards. And that was key, because conveying the concept that saving electricity at 2 in the morning wasn't really very useful. And somehow they had managed to convey in this very short time the importance of 7 o'clock. Anything else?
It was funny. I mean, the other ones weren't actually like that funny. I actually laughed out loud for that one.
That's California too. And that's, and as I'll say again, a good joke during these crises can save a gigawatt, because people will remember that and they will change their behavior if somehow maybe it starts with something humorous, but then it can become serious. Yeah.
And also just that showed consuming energy was like the take-home thing. It wasn't just like consume less, like use less, which is kind of like a negative message. It's like, go ahead and use energy, just use it at this time, not this time.
It wasn't critical of anybody, was it? It was let's do it together, as opposed to some other kind of message like you're wasting. These are subtle, but if a few million people see this, it can make a huge difference. How much time do I have?
We usually go until 11:30.
Okay. Yep. Good. All right. That means I have to find my PowerPoint. Just one moment. Bear with me. I have a few more of those videos later on. We can get to them. Oh, really? Oh. Okay, so we were here, and so let's go on to here. An example of this, you wanted a little bit of my career path. I was involved in helping to address the California electricity crisis in 2001. And then after that, I went to Paris to the International Energy Agency, and I thought I was going to bring the gospel of how you can save electricity in a hurry based on California's experience. And first thing I discovered is that there's this country called Brazil, and it actually had an electricity crisis the year before, And the whole country, which I thought was kind of a chaotic place, had reduced its electricity consumption twice as much as California had in the space of a couple months. And so, so I became very curious about how they did it. And what you saw there was a situation where the president said, we've got a drought, we don't have enough electricity, we need to cut back by 20%, and everybody's going to participate. And they implemented a whole lot of measures, but some of them were fun, some of them weren't. They said, if you don't use, you must use 20% less electricity than the year before, or we will disconnect you. To my knowledge, they never disconnected a person, but it was a threat. Meantime, though, they did all sorts of amazing things. For example, they said, we're going to shift all the football games from the evening with all the lights to daytime, so we won't have so much electricity consumption. They passed out compact fluorescent bulbs. They had competitions. They had all sorts of things going on. Competitions between communities, between neighborhoods and cities. And basically, from the president on down, they made this a national goal. And what are the results? Well, let's see. Here's the electricity consumption. I never know how to work these things. Let's help. Where's the point? Well, I'll use my finger, okay. So this is the total electricity consumption of the country of Brazil, and over years, and you can see there it's going along in its merry way, and then you hit the drought, and then they said, you must reduce your electricity consumption by 20%. This is a national crisis. And in the space of a few months, the whole country reduced its consumption 20%. And there's dozens of stories and explanations of how it was done, but basically the price of electricity to most consumers did not go up. It was not an economic tool that made this happen. It was mainly a recognition that this was a crisis and everybody needed to participate.
It seems like it's generation capacity, not the consumption, right? It's the y-axis in megawatts, megawatt hour. Based on the peak hour.
It was not, because it's a hydro system, many regions that are fundamentally hydro will talk about their electricity consumption in terms of average megawatts. And this is what they're showing now. So it's daily megawatts or weekly or something like that. Yeah.
Will you talk about the ramifications to kind of the energy industry, electricity industry, after these kinds of impacts? Meaning, there's clearly a lack of revenue, a revenue shortfall associated with now a big drop in consumption, and it looks like there's some persistence associated with that. But what does that drive more of these economies to shift to decoupling? Does that?
I don't think there's anything you can conclude about how the utilities responded after the fact, except in one case in Norway. No, I'm sorry, in Sweden. It was on a Friday, and the weather forecast was for Monday. They were going to have an extreme cold wave. And for various reasons, the grid authority could see that they were going to run short on electricity. And so, because in an economy, in a region like Sweden, they peak on Monday morning. And so they put out a public campaign, please don't use electricity on Monday morning. And the impact was so large that they had far more electricity available than they expected. The people were so willing to participate in this very short-term response. But the impact was on the electricity suppliers. They had a competitive market in the electricity supply side, was that a lot of the electricity suppliers, these independent generators and so on, got burned because they thought they were going to make a killing on Monday morning selling electricity into the market, but then they lost money. And they got really mad at the grid authority, and the grid authority promised never to ask consumers to reduce their electricity consumption again. So that doesn't answer your question, but it shows how complicated it can be. In the case of Brazil, you can see another phenomenon that electricity consumption never returned to the pre-drought level. That once people learned these new behaviors, they retained them. And that's an important lesson that you'll see everywhere, whether it's California, Brazil, or Japan.
Yeah, and back to Ben's point, I'm not sure everybody knows what decoupling really is. There's like thoughts about unbundling and decoupling as well, but decoupling, you mean like revenue not being tied to the amount that you sell, right? That's what you mean by that. So it is possible, like if all of the fixed costs are in your fixed portion of your energy tariff, then you are decoupled. So it is possible for that to happen, but very few, I think, in practice are willing to, put it all in the fixed costs. It's more politically tenable to put some in the volumetric because you feel like you're treating lower income people better by doing that under the assumption they use less. But it's sure to have some impact, especially if they reduce sales and it stays that way permanently. And maybe less so for the generators, right? Because they're being paid their marginal value in the market.
Sometimes.
But the distribution company, the wires company, they're trying to make the revenue back in the volumetric. It could cause the...
It's totally unpredictable. It depends upon the market. And that's why I was trying to describe Norway, Brazil, California. We still don't really know who was responsible for the electricity crisis in California in 2001. Maybe I should ask, how many people know about this piece of ancient history? Did people know that there was an electricity crisis in 2001 here? Half, maybe a little more. It was, well, Alyssa, you weren't here yet.
I wasn't here.
No. Ben might have been in California. You were in high school, maybe, or something?
I was in Connecticut at the time,
Oh, okay.
but I read about it.
Yeah, I definitely heard it. I mean, it was national news, especially when Gray Davis got booted.
Yes. This is where we lost the governor as a result of this. But you wanted me to talk a little bit about my background, and I'll use this as a part of the story. I wrote a book a little earlier called Supplying Energy Through Greater Efficiency. And in that we examined California and how much electricity could be saved through various efficiency improvements, mainly in the residential sector. So I thought I knew a lot about the energy sector of California, certainly at least the consumption side. And so when the crisis started bubbling up in 2001, I was really puzzled about, well, I didn't understand it. I couldn't figure out whether this was a supply problem or a consumption problem. And I thought that was a little embarrassing. And now I'm going to go forward far further because this, let's see if I can, I think that has it. No? We've just gone down a rat hole, excuse me, here.
So did you ever figure out if it was a supply or a consumption problem?
Well, I was going to try to show you an example. Oh, yeah. So this, this little graph is something I made. And if you go to most of the grid authorities now in the United States and in the rest of the world, you'll see a curve sort of like this, which is every hour or every 15 minutes, they'll show the total demand of electricity. And a few of them will show the available supplies, not all of them. But in 2001, the California ISO was a kind of a new thing. And all they showed in California was two numbers, the total demand for electricity in that 15 minutes and the forecasted demand for the next 15 minutes. And I called them and said, you know, it would be useful to just make a plot, some sort of graph or something. And they just sort of said, go away. We're busy trying to solve the crisis. And also I said, well, how about trying to tell us how much electricity is available? It's nice to know how much is demanded, but really the question is, what's the difference between what's available and what's being demanded? I got nowhere. And so somehow I got a little money together and started the first website where you could see in real time the demand for electricity, plus there are a few other things that we got in there. And then we kind of had to guess what the supply was because the ISO wouldn't tell us. They said it was confidential. And we kind of made a guess, and then we would show that on a website. And that became basically one of the most sought after websites during the electricity crisis. We knew that everybody from the Secretary of Energy in Washington to people in the utilities were looking at it, plus lots of other people. We were competing actually with Yahoo in terms of hits at that time because it was the only place where you could see the electricity consumption and demand in real time and what was going on. And eventually the California ISO said, well, maybe this isn't quite so confidential, maybe this is a good idea, and they copied it. And then we watched, then Tokyo had its problems, and they copied California. And now you can see this kind of curve all around the world, and it's actually kind of satisfying as I walked through Tokyo during the last electricity crisis to see something very similar to that. I maybe can show you a picture and saying, yeah, I do that first on my whiteboard, and now it's sort of the common way. Okay, so that's how I got involved in some of this. My journey to the supply side. Usually I'm concerned about the consumption side, but this was one of the few times where I've sort of taken a step to the complicated world of electricity supply, which I confess I still don't understand at all. So let's go back. How do I do this? This is a new computer for me, and I'm still working on that. Let's see. Okay. So that we did. So California was this crisis that that I can say was mainly a problem caused by a bungled deregulation, combined with a drought, combined with some heat waves. So lots of things were going on at the same time, and they converged in a way that created the crisis. But to somebody's credit, I think the governor that eventually got kicked out, he hired somebody to create a program to save electricity. And this person was remarkable because his skills were in campaign management and political campaigns. And he said, we're going to mobilize everybody in California as if this is a political campaign. And so he created this whole message and the idea that you're not going to criticize anybody. We're in this together. These are what things you do, and certain measures that you should take. These are the best measures, when you should take them. And then as progress was made, you're doing great, California, keep it up, keep it up. This is how you can, we're in this together and we're almost there. The transformer is almost back in the utility, if you think about the Arizona case. And then in that way, kept Californians engaged and reduced electricity consumption by 15%. And humor was a constant part of it, and I believe still a very important part. Okay, so now I've been talking about saving electricity in a hurry for a while. I had a class and one of the students by the name of Wayne Lady took this course, and he was from Alaska, from the city of Juneau. And he went back to Alaska after he graduated, and then I think it was on a Friday, I got a call from him, an email. He said, we've got a problem in Juneau. There's this avalanche, and it wiped out the transmission line bringing electricity into Juneau. And so as a result, they were running on diesel power. And they weren't sure, there really wasn't enough diesel capacity. It wasn't very reliable. And so he realized all the things I'd been talking about, saving electricity in a hurry, how do you create a campaign, was what Juno needed. And to make a long story short, 3 days later, the Secretary of Energy sent me to Juno to help plan a program to save electricity in a hurry. So it's really dangerous to become a noted authority and just write about it, because at some point, somebody might call your bluff and ask you to do it. Well, so I was parachuted into Juno to reduce the electricity consumption as fast as we could possibly make it. And so for 3 days, I was talking to the mayor, on television, on radio, doing audits, doing everything possible to introduce people to the aspects of saving electricity in a hurry. We even created a logo, because you have to make a unifying theme, people to recognize what is this campaign. So it became Juno Unplugged, and we did that in 24 hours. But we also needed to make sure that we were saving the right electricity. The utility there didn't really even know where the electricity was going, and the most dangerous thing is to try to save electricity that wasn't being used in the first place. So we tried, one of the things we discovered is the airport was a major consumer of electricity. So they seriously considered switching off all the runway lights at the airport, which is the only way you can get to Juno, during the night. And they actually then decided maybe that wasn't a good idea, but they figured out some middle measures. But we had to figure out where the electricity was going, and then measures to save it, and most important, to give them make sure that they don't try to save energy in ways that won't be successful. One example is everybody said, I'm not going to open my refrigerator door as often. That's how I'm going to conserve energy. Turns out that has a very small impact on your energy use in a refrigerator. Similarly, like pulling the plug on your cell phone charger, it's a highly visible kind of measure, but it makes no difference. But that water heater, that electric water heater, may be set much higher. And those long showers and the hot water you use for the laundry, all those could have a huge impact, but they're all almost invisible. So we had to try to guide people to measures that were likely to save energy. And the impact was fairly clear. Here was the energy use. Let's see, 2009. I have to get the right year right here. And then there's the red one. The electricity consumption just plummeted. And there's several things going on. So several trends going on. It was getting warmer, and the days getting longer. So the actual, reduction was 40%, but after you make seasonal adjustments, it was somewhere around a 25% reduction in electricity use in the space of a month. And then they eventually fixed the transmission line, and look, the electricity use began to increase again, but it never really got back to the original levels. And here too, every night, they would be showing pictures on TV about the progress in replacing those transmission lines. And so people knew that when the crisis would be over, because they would see it on TV as that transmission line being built. And the price of electricity never went up. So that was another whole separate crisis of who was going to pay for this catastrophe. But so it was all behavioral and very little anything else. So I described a few of these examples of electricity crises that have occurred, and I didn't cover all of them, but you can see that under the right circumstances, there is a certain amount of flexibility in the demand for electricity that can be achieved through behavioral change. It's not something that can happen for a long time necessarily, and I'm not sure I would like to ask consumers to do it more than once in every few years, because they will get very suspicious and they probably will kick you out of office or something like that on the second or third time. But it is a tool, and compared to the alternatives, it might be the best way to go. So let's see if I have a couple other conclusions. Right, that's everything I mentioned. Of course, I wanted to come back to economics. Psychologists have at least 80 different theories of change in behavior. Curiously or bizarrely, economists have focused on one and done almost all of their research and their analysis and theories based on one behavioral model. Meanwhile, the psychologists have another 80 of them for theories of behavior change under certain conditions. And when we have a crisis, we need to deal with all 80 plus, or however many there are, not just the economics, the viewpoint on behavior change. It's useful, but it's only one of 80. And in that kind of situation, we need to think about humor. We need to think about your civic responsibilities. There are many kinds of aspects that need to be captured to get this behavior change, but it can happen. And I guess the thing that got me thinking recently, and I'm glad I got asked to give this presentation now, is much of this work was done 5+ years ago. In fact, now we have a very different situation in the electricity market where we have a lot of local generators on our roofs or in our neighborhoods, and that's going to be increasing. And so this relationship about saving electricity in a hurry may take a very different form in the future. And I don't quite know what it's going to be, but I think it's going to be exciting and it's going to be different. But once again, I suspect we're going to come back to many of these same concepts. So I'm going to stop there and take more questions, and then I don't know what you want after that. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
How can this kind of be applied to the current PG&E power shutoffs for the wildfires? Because that's kind of a different problem. It's not just a lack of capacity. It's a kind of a different issue. So can this kind of conclusion be applied?
That's a very good question. How can it be? How can these studies and this experience be applied to the most recent California power outages? The short answer is I'm not sure. The longer answer is I imagine that one of the strategies that California will employ is to try to make more parallel and redundant systems to provide electricity. Those redundant systems may not be able to have the same capacity as the kind of the primary system, and so while a complete shutdown may not be required, they may need to reduce demand to match the capacity of that the backup transmission lines. But that's about all I have right now, except also the increase in the local generation from rooftops and neighborhoods. Yeah.
So I have a question about, so obviously we have the duck curve in California where, net demand bottoms out in the middle of the day and we have this huge peaking problem. And a lot of people are trying to solve that with storage to try to move, excess solar from the middle to the peaks. But I always wonder if there could be work done to better match energy consumption to that curve to basically raise net demand. And so I'm wondering if you can think of any ways that your research on sort of crisis behavior change, what can we learn from that for these maybe longer term changing of energy consumption behaviors to match, now that we have more renewables that have, certain times of day where they peak doesn't match consumption peaks, how can we move consumption peaks to match energy production peaks?
I think I'm going to try to avoid answering that question a little bit. But on the other hand, there's a saying, never waste the crisis. And a lot of the the lessons that came in like the California crisis were about telling people to change the timing of their consumption, not only the amount, but the scheduling. And so you can introduce some of those concepts, and they will stick to some extent, but I can't be sure how much will. I don't have anything more to say now. Yeah.
Kind of a related question is, all of the examples you showed were like really short-term savings, and there was some lingering effect, but it was much, much smaller. And so I know that, you know, a lot of the things that happened during that crisis to cause the really large change were, there was a lot of marketing, messaging, threats from the government, things like that. But then those go away after the crisis is passed. And so I guess what I'm just wondering is, if we do really want to see long-term energy reductions of that same scale, can we just continue to do the same things, or is the fact that there's a crisis critical to actually getting people to say, like, do people need to believe that there's a crisis, that this is short-term, and that they just need to like buckle up and do this for a month, and then everything gets better?
I think here I may answer a slightly different question, but when we look at the climate crisis, is this something that, is anything we learned here relevant to the climate crisis, or something much longer? And yes and no. I don't think many of these strategies can persist for too long. And so we need to think of a new way of addressing people's attitudes and behaviors in a longer term. These are really short term, but acknowledging that they will have, they could have some long term or persistent results. I'm not going to say that this is a climate change solution, but it could contribute to it. Somebody go ahead and talk. You.
I have a question about the kind of like effectiveness for each category. I mean, like industrial, commercial, and like domestic sector, like
Yes.
as a like electricity consumption. Because like I'm not sure about the other countries, but in Korea, like industrial electricity consumption is like, and like the commercial one is like more than 3/4, and the like domestic use, like domestic electricity use is like less than 50. I mean, about like 50%, and like every summer, like government is advertising to reduce the electricity consumption, you know, because of the like heat wave, like recently. So, but like one of the people's complaint is like why governments put like much lower price for the like industrial and commercial and put higher price for the like domestic use, and they are just like forcing to reduce the electricity consumption for the like domestic use. Like, I mean, just like, you know, like normal people. So like, I think like the campaigns you showed us is more likely kind of like encouraging to reduce the electricity consumption for the like domestic use, not the like industrial or commercial use. So was there any like kind of like data to show like how effective it was to reduce the electricity consumption in the like domestic sector, like industrial sector, and like commercial sector?
Yeah, I think you raise a very good point. Korea is an example of a country with a national policy to have low electricity prices for the industry and high for residences. Curiously, I think Japan is the, well, I don't want to compare it, but other countries have different strategies, but it's most evident in Korea, this discrepancy. And so it's true that a lot of this messaging is aimed at residential consumers, and so it's much harder to make the industry and commercial sectors adjust. But it has happened, and also sometimes you can use the crisis to change the tariff structure. That's a really good time to get those changes that you're talking about and people are complaining about. During that crisis, let's get industry now to pay its fair share. And I can say though that even in the California case, there was significant commercial participation in it. And they really made a point of making sure that stores and some businesses would participate. And curiously, in Juneau, one of the problems was the people, like in office workers, they wanted to make their office building use less electricity, but the owners didn't. And so the consumers, or the office workers, would be turning on, unplugging lights and everything, and then the manager of the building would be going in and screwing them back in and doing all sorts of other things. So there was all sorts of peculiar tensions going on, and that's an example of it.
So it seems like it has to be a combination between the actual lifestyle shift as far as like culture through advertisement and like the actual economic plans to like take tariffs or whatever, higher tax or penalties for using more electricity. But how do you think we should address disparities as far as wealth goes? Because at the end of the day, like there may be a short-term effect of saying like, yeah, we're going to stop using electricity for these times of day, but for the people that can't afford it, which is largely like who we're trying to target because they're probably using more electricity, how do we stop the disparities between those that are just like, whatever, just tax me because I'm going to use my electricity regardless of those that can't afford to make that decision? Those
are good questions. And there's another, one could have another presentation called Saving Electricity Gradually. And that's the place we need to address your questions because those are important, and you need to have the right economic framework. You need to speak about equity, distribution, so on. But those aren't problems that you're going to solve in the short term. So that's not what I'm dealing with here. Yeah.
I'm wondering what kind of data is available about energy consumption patterns between different demographics, because now there are corporations with algorithms that know you better than you know yourself, and like targeted advertising, I feel like is how a lot of at least millennials and people who are very active on social media and stuff get their information. And I'm wondering if there could be an ad campaign that like knows how different people are using energy and could like specifically target that kind of use.
You raise a very important point. And all of this was, almost all of this was pre-Facebook and certainly pre-algorithms and certainly pre-Alexa and a few other, and pre-Nest thermostats and a few other kinds of devices, which at least in the residential sector could have an enormous impact on first gathering the information about who is susceptible to energy savings and then delivering it to them. And I imagine the next set of electricity crisis will be harnessing those kinds of tools in ways that I can't even begin to imagine right now.
So who do you think should be in charge of the advertising campaigns that you mentioned at the beginning?
So you asked who should be in charge of the advertising campaign. That's a very important question. In the case of California, we realized several things. That the consumers, let me take we out of it. Somebody realized, and I think it was a couple people in the governor's office at that point, realized that the consumers trusted nobody. They despised the utility. The state didn't seem to know what's going on, and so that as a result, that it was decided that a separate entity had to be created to run this campaign, completely out of any other agency.
So a follow-up question to that would be: you claim that it's going to result in about 1 gigawatt reduction in the energy demand.
Don't hold me to that number. And I said that was a good joke. It was worth a gigawatt. But anyway, yes.
Yeah, but because the advertisement is going to be very expensive, right? A couple of $100,000 for a 30-second advertisement that was taken online. So you want it in a few networks, a few times a day, and creating a separate entity to do this whole campaign. It's not going to be cheap.
Absolutely.
Compared
I didn't say it was going to be cheap, but the alternative, the cost of the blackouts, well, we've seen evidence of what happens. And I believe that this approach would be much cheaper than the blackouts and the economic chaos that would result.
So what about creating some backup power plants just in case of surge in demand? That might be not clean, but considering the tax for the CO2 still make it a viable economic option. Is that something that has been
one of the reasons we probably had a crisis in California is the amount of reserves capacity had dwindled a lot as a result of deregulation. But the fact is that's really expensive to keep around for the 1 or 2 events every few years. And so remember, a gigawatt of power plant's going to cost, I don't know, $5–8 billion. If you want to keep that much reserve capacity around, you're not going to do that anymore.
I mean, I think in California, it wasn't that the physical reserves weren't available.
Yeah, for 2001, it was a different story in regulation, but the current condition, you could have some sort of backup plan, not to generate a new facility, but import from other states.
And we do. We have we have an extensive transmission system all the way from the Columbia River down to Los Angeles. There's a DC intertie, for example. And these were created expressly for those kinds of purposes, to share the capacity in case of problems and to make sure that you can put water behind the dams in the Columbia River and then bring it down during the hot summer days in Los Angeles. And so that has been created, but it's very expensive to build that capacity and transmission. And so you want to do it with care. Ben?
I want to go back to something you said, and I think it relates to this, which is with this current crisis, it's much more localized, right? It's the idea of having parallel redundant systems to tie with potential generation, that it's local generation, or in a way that would have capacity limits, right? So you could imagine a call for a community to reduce electricity in a hurry in their own local kind of crisis area, right?
Yes.
And so there's 2 questions around that. I think you've been doing work to identify at the residential level certain critical infrastructure that you'd want to maintain during a low power event, right? So garage door openers, that's by law, but then refrigerator, internet and communications devices, maybe some lighting, right? What about at the community scale level? I mean, you mentioned Alaska, turning off airport lighting was probably a bad idea, right? So there's certain critical infrastructure can communities think about, kind of making sure that they have almost dialed into like a, when you know you're going to do a power outage, instead of doing a power outage, we're going to drop down to these minimum level kind of power. And my corollary question is, knowing what you know about Brazil, Juneau, these various communities you work with, what type of pre-planning or what type of infrastructure, connectivity, or parallel redundant systems would having in place beforehand made it really easy much easier for that community to respond?
I think I'll answer that last question first. When I wrote this book, Saving Electricity in a Hurry, it was designed for policymakers, and I think I put in the foreword, you probably shouldn't even bother to read this until the crisis hits you. And then this is what you should do, and start from there, because it's very difficult to predict what the crises will be and then how to go forward. However, there was one thing that was clear in every case, you needed to know where your electricity went, who consumed it and when, so that you could design a program that would target the major users. And in that case, California was in a far superior position than every other place that I've seen. Dealing with sort of this future situation where maybe we have redundant transmission, I haven't really thought that out well enough yet. So I'm not sure at what level, whether it should be community or county level or regional level, because again, it depends on how this redundancy is built into the system. I don't think I can answer your question to complete satisfaction, but I'll leave it there. Yeah.
It's a different situation, but is there any lesson from this that could be applicable to PG&E or any other California utility doing the mandatory power shutoffs?
Well, I think PG&E is, no, I'm going to stay away from that one. Thank you. I don't know who's listening.
It was interesting, Alan. I was just thinking about John's question about having short-term attitudes. I was trying to think back in history about really successful long campaigns where they try to change behavior. One was like Smoking the Bear. Like thinking about Smoking the Bear is a long time ago. You still in your mind know what Smoking the Bear is telling you. Like when you go camping, you see the Smoking the Bear. You know what the different levels are. So it's just interesting to think maybe there's something that can be developed for electricity here for saving electricity in some way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That a lot of people think of behavior as something that's static, but that's absolutely wrong. It's highly dynamic. Your behavior is changing and adapting constantly. And some examples that are attitudes towards, well, seat belts, using seat belts that went from 0 people use them to now almost everybody uses them. Or bicycle helmets, that's sort of maybe that's not a good one. Smoking is something that went from something that was tolerated widely to now it's where smoking areas were the default. Everything was smoking unless there was some very important reason you couldn't. But now it's absolutely the opposite. Non-smoking is the default. And drinking and driving is another thing. People, at least in theory, have changed to a great extent their attitudes towards that. Even larger cultural issues like racism and so on can change surprisingly rapidly. And so we need to acknowledge that this is it's not like behavior is this stone edifice here. It's actually something more pliable, and that we've got to make little changes if necessary and to save electricity in these cases. Yeah.
Okay, just really quick question. You mentioned how there were all these different behavioral models for how people use electricity, and I was just curious if we were interested in learning more about these models. Are there other who are the faculty on campus potentially who are studying this intersection of behavior and energy use?
So I wasn't clear there because I'm still trying to figure out how to formulate this, but there are dozens, if over 80, because I have a book about this, over 80 different theories of behavior change, not specifically devoted to energy, but what's the difference? It's just it's behavior change, and so the question then is what faculty are doing that? Oh boy, I'd have to think about that. Help me, rescue me, Alyssa.
I don't know if there are that many people outside of the economics area working on energy and behavior, but I would guess that you would find people both in the psychology and the business school who thought about different ways of I don't know if Alan knows this, I have an alter ego. I have an identical twin sister who works in advertising. And what she would say is, if you want to inspire sort of, you can inspire loyalty, let's say, to a brand, it's actually about connecting emotionally and typically trying to find those positive emotions. So that's the Smokey the Bear to some extent. People have brand loyalty to Smokey, even if we don't think of it that way. And that actually can be more durable than humor, whereas humor is quite memorable, which is very effective, right, for getting people to remember something, but may not have sort of the durability that a more sort of deeper emotional connection will have to an issue. So I'm guessing that in the marketing side of things, you get people thinking about that kind of, how to communicate that way for longer term sort of, like, anyway, I was going to say SMUD has brand loyalty among its users, whereas PG&E has hatred among its. It's true. I mean,
it's absolutely
people, and so when SMUD does a campaign reminding us to turn everything off between 5 and 7, and they did a campaign without humor, it was just everywhere. We all remembered it, and I think we largely do it. And it's a longer term thing, right? They want us to do it for a long time. But I do think it is interesting to think about the requirements for these shorter term behavior changes where you want people to feel good and to act and to do these things versus maybe the longer term stuff, which I'm sure there are other ways or models of thinking about inspiring longer term behavior change. Yeah.
One thing is Sarah Alcall is a researcher affiliated with the Institute. So if you are interested in behavioral issues, she would be someone that you can connect with. She's based out of Boston, but
well, we actually have Angela Sanguinetti here, who's worked on. There are a few people, and if you get me out of the spotlight, I might remember them.
But I was going to say also for your question, it would be good to look around and see if there are at least people working on the methods and theories that you would want to know about, even if they're not specifically working on energy behavior.
And I should say, even though I cast all these disparaging comments on the economists and the fact that they're using only one out of these 80 plus theories of behavior change, there's actually a lot of innovative activities going on there, and you should not ignore them. That they are part of the solution. Sometimes.
All right, thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Ellen. My sister, she, for my class, she studied when she was in Norway. That's energy and other programs they have on environmental stuff. And I feel like they have a long history of physical body personality. And we're all and just kids, because like the health babies
Where in the Norwegian policy, if you if it's necessary,